The night was still. Heavy silence hung in the air. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Chris stood in the dark, staring at the empty rooms around him. His family, his wife, Shannon, and their 2 young daughters were gone. He'd told the police that they had vanished. But something didn't add up. Something in his gut twisted as he watched the shadows move across the walls. His mind raced. The lies he'd told, the stories he'd spun, each one unraveling like a thread. He hadn't expected to be caught. But the truth had a way of finding its way out. The investigation had started slow, but quickly it built momentum. The police found traces of something more sinister beneath his calm exterior. Shannon's friends, her family, none of them believed his story. They knew something wasn't right. The first crack came when the surveillance footage was discovered. It was from the early morning hours. Chris was seen loading something into his truck. Something heavy. Something he hadn't wanted anyone to see. He hadn't been alone when it all started. Shannon had been alive when he'd last seen her.
She had even fought back.
But Chris had silenced her. And when the 2 girls, Bella and Celeste, awoke in the early morning hours, they had no idea what had happened. The panic in their eyes, the screams, he would never forget them. But it was too late. His hands were stained, his soul broken. As the investigation unfolded, a clearer picture emerged. Shannon had trusted him, loved him, and he had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. Now, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him, he couldn't escape it. The truth had finally caught up with him. Every detail, every dark corner of his life was now exposed. The life he had built, the family he had destroyed, was laid bare for the world to see. And there was no turning back. The cold metal bars of his prison cell felt like an eternal reminder. The faces of his daughters haunted him, their laughter, their cries, echoing in his mind. In the end, there was no justice, just the cold truth. And nothing moored to the walls of his cell felt suffocating. Each breath, each movement, seemed to weigh him down more. He tried to sleep, but the faces of his family haunted him. Shannon's smile, Bella's bright eyes, Celeste's soft giggle. But it wasn't just their faces. It was their last moments. The moments he could never erase from his mind. The sound of their voices, the struggle, the silence that followed. He could feel it even now. A chill ran down his spine as he remembered their fear. How they had trusted him. How they had loved him. He thought about the lies he told. The stories he crafted to cover his tracks.
But none of it mattered now.
The truth was out. The trial had come. And now he faced the consequences. His family was gone, and nothing could bring them back. No amount of remorse could undo the horror he had caused. As the courtroom buzzed with the whispers of the audience, Chris stood silent, his eyes downcast. He could hear the anger in the voices of the victims' families, but he could not face them. Not yet. The verdict was inevitable.
He was guilty.
Guilty of a crime so vile that no one could understand why. A crime so cold that even the hardest hearts couldn't comprehend it. He'd murdered the people he swore to protect. The pain, the sorrow in their eyes, it would never leave him. No matter where he went, no matter how many years he spent in prison, he would carry it with him. There was no escaping it. His actions had destroyed everything. His family, his life, his future. He had nothing left. And yet, he still couldn't escape the one question that lingered in his mind.
Why?
Why had he done it? There was no answer. Just the cold, unfeeling truth. And the silence that followed. The world would remember him, not as a father, not as a husband, but as a murderer. That was his legacy. That was his fate. Nothing more. The days blended together, each one colder than the last. Chris sat in his cell, staring at the cracked concrete wall. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was his only company. He had stopped trying to sleep. Sleep meant nightmares. Nightmares of their faces. Shannon's pleading eyes, Bella's tiny hands reaching for him, Celeste's innocent voice calling out. They haunted him, even in the stillness of the night. He had been given life in prison. but it felt like death. Not just the life without parole, but the emptiness inside him. He couldn't wash away the guilt. It clung to him like a second skin. His mind often wandered back to that morning, the last time he had seen them all. The final moments. He could still feel the weight of Shannon's body in his hands. Still hear the echo of Bella's voice, so full of life, so trusting. It all came rushing back when he least expected it. The question he could never answer.
Why?
Why did he do it? Chris had spent hours, days, even weeks trying to find an explanation. But there was none. His actions had been cold, calculated, and senseless. His wife, his daughters, he had taken them away in an instant. For what? To hide an affair? To escape a life he didn't want? The reasons seemed so small now, so insignificant, compared to the horror he had unleashed. The world had seen him as a monster. His name would never be forgotten. But the worst part was knowing that no one would ever truly understand what went through his mind that night. The chilling emptiness inside him when he looked at their lifeless bodies. The lack of remorse in those first hours. The lies he told. The deception. The guilt didn't come right away. It built, slowly, like a heavy stone in his chest, until it was all-consuming. By the time he confessed, it was too late. The damage had already been done. There was no redemption for him. No forgiveness. He would live with this truth forever. And as he lay awake in his cell, he realized something. There was no escape from it. No place where he could hide. Not in his mind. Not in his heart. He had taken their lives. And now he was paying the price. Not just in prison, but in his own soul. The days turned into weeks. And then months. But the weight never lifted. Chris sat in his small, cold cell, his eyes hollow. The endless ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound that filled the silence. The world outside had moved on. But not him. He couldn't move on. The faces of his daughters, Bella and Celeste, were burned into his memory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. He saw their innocence, their love for him, their trust. He could still hear their voices in his head. Soft whispers of "Daddy" that never got to finish. Each night, they crept into his dreams, like shadows, reminding him of what he had done. The shame clawed at him, but the regret, the true, soul-deep regret, was something different. It wasn't just the loss of his family. It was the realization that he had destroyed everything he had ever known. The anger in the courtroom had been raw, unrelenting. The faces of the victims' families twisted with grief. They had every right to be furious, to want answers. And still, he had no answers. No reason that could ever explain the horror he had caused.
Not to them.
Not to himself. He had once been a man with hopes, with dreams. But now, all he had were the ghosts of the life he had stolen. In the silence of his cell, he tried to understand it. What had driven him to do it? To end the lives of his own flesh and blood. Some days, it felt as if he was floating, detached from reality, like he was watching it all unfold from a distance. He couldn't make sense of any of it. The affair. The lies. The violence. It was like he had become someone else entirely. A man he didn't recognize. The world outside spoke of him in whispers. A murderer. A monster. A man who took everything from his family, without remorse. But inside, he was just a broken shell. He thought about Shannon, her bright smile, her voice, the way she had tried to hold their family together. He thought about Bella and Celeste, how they should have had a lifetime ahead of them. A lifetime he had taken. And now, they would never have a chance to grow up, to experience life, to make their own memories. They were gone. And all he had left was the cold, unforgiving truth. No matter how hard he tried to escape it, the truth remained. It was always there, lingering in the darkest corners of his mind. There was no redemption, no forgiveness, only the unbearable weight of the truth. And in his cell, he knew he would never be free from it. Not ever. The nights were the worst. The quiet in his cell seemed louder than anything else. In the stillness, Memories came crashing in like waves, relentless and unforgiving. He could no longer hide from them. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Sean, Bella, and Celeste over and over again. But this time, it wasn't just their faces. It was the screams, the last cries for help that he would never forget. He'd tried to block them out at first, told himself it was just part of the process. The shock.
But no.
It was guilt. Pure, suffocating guilt. The hollow, aching feeling in his chest never subsided. His body seemed to tremble even when it was still. No matter how much he tried to focus on anything else, it always came back to them. The small moments, the ones that seemed insignificant at the time, now seemed like the most precious things. Shannon's laugh, a gentle sound that echoed in the house before the tragedy. Bella's childish jokes. Celeste's little hand reaching out for him. All gone. Gone forever because of his selfishness. His selfish desire to escape a life he had willingly chosen. And then there was the lie he had told himself. That somehow he could erase the past. That somehow he could hide from the truth. But no matter where he turned, the truth found him. And it cut deeper with every passing day. He tried to talk to the other inmates, tried to distract himself with menial conversations. But it didn't work.
They all knew who he was.
Everyone did. The whispers in the halls were constant. Chris Watts. The family killer.
He was a monster to them.
And in a way, he was. But he didn't need anyone to tell him that. He already knew. There was no escaping the pain. No running away from the things he had done. Even in the darkest corners of his mind, he knew there would never be redemption. The cold truth was that he had destroyed everything. His family, his life, his future. He had taken it all away with his own hands. And now, the years would stretch out before him, a long, empty existence with no end in sight. The walls of his prison were his only company. There would be no more birthdays. No more anniversaries. No more moments of joy. Only the echoes of the past and the truth that would haunt him forever. And it was in that eternal silence that he realized there was no way out. Not of the prison. Not of his mind. He would carry this burden until his last breath. And it would never, ever let him go. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Chris had become a ghost in his own life. The heavy weight of his actions pressed on him at all times, smothering him in a constant fog of regret. He could feel the whispers behind his back, even when no one spoke. The other inmates had made their opinions clear from the start. Some mocked him. Others avoided him like he was a disease. But none of it mattered. He didn't care anymore.
The walls of his cell were his world now.
The world outside was a distant, unreachable place. A place that had moved on without him. A place that had forgotten him. And that was the hardest part, knowing that no matter how much he suffered, he would never get back what he had taken. The quiet had become unbearable. In his solitude, Chris often found himself replaying the night of the murders, over and over again. It was like a loop that never stopped. The moment when everything shifted. The moment when he took that step, crossing the line from husband to killer. What had he been thinking? What had driven him? The rage, the coldness. It was like something had taken over him. At first, he had tried to convince himself that it wasn't his fault, that he was pushed to the edge. But as the months wore on, the truth became undeniable. He had made a choice that had ended the lives of the people he was supposed to love and protect. And there was no justification. None. In the quiet of his cell, Chris's thoughts were a prison of their own. His memories, his guilt, they were the bars that kept him locked in. Sometimes he could almost feel them with him, his family, their presence, their energy, lingering in the corners of his mind. But it wasn't a comfort.
It was suffocating.
They were gone, and he was the one who had taken them from the world. No apology, no confession, no time served could undo the horror. And as the days dragged on, Chris began to wonder how long it would be before he truly lost his mind. The mental toll was relentless. The emotional ache gnawed at him in ways he didn't know were possible. Was this his punishment? A life trapped in a nightmare of his own making? There was no redemption, no forgiveness, just the eternal silence and the haunting faces of the people he had murdered. As time moved forward, so did the world outside. People moved on with their lives. New crimes made headlines. The Watts case became just another dark chapter in the true crime world. But for Chris, it was his entire life. The world would never forget him. But in the end, it didn't matter. He had already forgotten what it was like to be human, to feel anything but this relentless emptiness. And as the years continued to pass, he realized that his punishment wasn't just the time he would serve in prison. It was the unbearable, crushing weight of knowing that he would never, ever escape the truth. That was the real prison. The one that would hold him captive for the years wore on, each one blending into the next, a never-ending cycle of remorse. Chris had stopped counting the days. Time had lost all meaning in the confines of his cell. He existed now, not as a man, but as a shadow of one. The images of Shanand, Bella, and Celeste never left him. Not a moment went by without their faces in his mind. But now, the memories were darker. They were no longer just reminders of his family. They had become his tormentors, his constant companions, watching him, judging him. He had tried to block them out, tried to force himself to think of something else. But it was impossible. The faces of his daughters, their voices, their laughter, everything was burned into his soul. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the guilt. It was a part of him now, woven into his very being. He would wake in the middle of the night, sweating, his heart racing. The nightmares were worse than the waking hours. He would dream of the moment he had done it, those final, brutal acts, and he could never wake up in time. He would see Bella's face, twisted in fear, her small body shaking as she begged him. He would hear Shanann's voice, pleading with him, calling out for mercy. But there had been none. No mercy. And every time, Chris would wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, his body trembling as if it were still happening. But it wasn't just the nights that haunted him. It was the days, too. The constant isolation. The endless hours of silence, punctuated only by the sound of the guards' footsteps echoing down the hall. No visitors. No friends. No family. No one cared about him anymore. Not after what he had done. In his solitude, he had been forced to confront the darkest parts of himself. There was no one to distract him. No one to soothe his mind. He couldn't escape the reality of his actions. The more he thought about it, the more he realized just how far he had fallen. He had been a father, a husband. He had once had dreams, plans for a future. But now, all he had was the prison of his own mind. And the worst part?
He didn't know how to stop it.
He didn't know how to live with what he had done. The guilt was a suffocating force, tightening around his chest with every breath. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, there was no way out. No way to undo the damage. No way to bring back his family. All that was left was the dark, unrelenting truth. He had destroyed his life. And with it, the lives of those he had sworn to protect. And there was no redemption for that. There was no escaping it. Not even in the silence. Not even in the endless years ahead. As the years stretched on, the weight of his actions became more oppressive. The silence in his cell felt like a suffocating blanket, a constant reminder of what he had done. Chris no longer counted the days. The world outside had moved on. People had forgotten his name, or at least, they'd moved on to the next headline. But inside the prison walls, Chris was a ghost. A living reminder of a tragedy that had shattered so many lives. But it wasn't just the world outside that had moved on. It was his own soul. Each day he sat in that cell, staring at the same cracked wall, he could feel parts of himself slipping away. Pieces of the man he once was, the father, the husband, dissolving into the nothingness of his regret. In his solitude, the truth had become his only companion. The faces of Shanand, Bella, and Celeste were always there. Every minute, every second. It was like they had become a part of him, their eyes staring back at him from the darkness. And yet, He couldn't escape the thought that, no matter how much he punished himself, no matter how much he suffered, it wouldn't bring them back. It wouldn't undo the horror. It wouldn't erase the destruction he had caused. Time wasn't healing him. It was only making the wound deeper. Prison wasn't just a physical confinement. It was a psychological prison, one that he couldn't break out of. And it was a prison of his own making. The guards came and went. The meals were delivered. The lights dimmed at night, but none of it mattered. The bars on the window were just as cold as the bars in his mind. He had tried to fill the emptiness with anything. Books. Conversations with other inmates. Yet, nothing could quiet the deafening silence in his heart. At times, he would catch himself wondering how long it would take for him to completely lose his mind. The endless repetition of his thoughts, the constant guilt, the never-ending regret. How long before it consumed him entirely? He had been so sure of his actions at the time, so certain that he could control everything. But now, looking back, he realized how fragile everything had been. How fragile he had been. His life had once seemed so normal, so perfect. A family, a home, a future. And now, nothing remained. Just the harsh reality of a man who had taken it all away. As the years passed, Chris stopped trying to find answers. There was no answer. Only the consequences. And every day, those consequences gnawed at him more and more. He could feel it deep in his bones. The punishment was never going to stop. It would be with him forever. His guilt. His regret. His brokenness. They had become his existence. He had no family to call his own anymore. No life to look forward to. Just the quiet, the endless quiet, and the faces of his daughters, forever staring back at him. And in that silence, he knew the truth. There was no escape. No way out. Not for him. Not anymore if the years dragged on, and Chris felt the passage of time like a slow, agonizing crawl. His body had withered, but his mind had become a prison far worse than the one surrounding him. The silence of his cell felt thicker with each passing day, heavier. And yet, the ghosts of his family never left. Sean and Bella and Celeste, they were always there, their faces etched into his thoughts like a permanent scar. The images of their last moments, the final screams, the helplessness in their eyes, haunted him. But what haunted him most was the guilt that gnawed at his soul, relentless and gnawing, a hunger he could never satisfy. No matter how many years he spent in this cold concrete tomb, it wouldn't be enough. There was no redemption here. Only time. And time, he realized, wasn't going to heal anything. It only deepened the wound. He had long since given up trying to explain his actions to himself. The truth was too ugly, too raw. He had murdered his family. And there was no reason, no justification that could ever make that okay. His past, his choices, they all weighed him down with a suffocating heaviness. Every minute he sat there in that cell, alone, it became harder to breathe. The isolation was consuming him. The faces of his children, those innocent, trusting eyes, became more distorted in his mind. He could no longer separate the man he had been from the man he was now. Who was he? Was he still that man who once dreamed of a life with his wife and daughters? The man who had kissed them goodnight, watched their lives unfold before him? Or was he only the monster, the man who had taken everything away? The prisoner inside, locked in both the world outside and the one inside his mind, was a different version of the man who had been free. He had been someone else. Someone he didn't even recognize anymore. Each day, Chris spent hours in his cell, staring at the bare walls, trying to make sense of what had happened. But nothing made sense. The lies, the deceit, the affair, it had all spiraled into something he couldn't control. And in the end, he had destroyed the most precious thing he ever had. His family. Now, he was left with nothing. No one to talk to. No one to share his pain with. Every fleeting moment of connection with the world outside felt like a distant memory. In his cell, he had become invisible, a non-person, a walking reminder of one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. And yet, no matter how much time passed, there was no relief. No moment of clarity. He had killed his family. That was the only truth left. And it would never leave him. Not in this life. Not in the next. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't escape it. The truth was a shadow that clung to him, following him wherever he went. And as the years continued to pass, Chris began to understand that this was his punishment. Not the prison walls, not the bars, but the unrelenting truth. It would haunt him forever. There was no moving on. Not for him. Not ever. His soul was chained, and he would carry that burden for the rest of his days. The years wore on, but nothing changed for Chris. He existed in a world of shadows, a ghost of the man he had once been. Prison had become a suffocating cage, but it wasn't just the concrete walls that confined him. It was the weight of his own mind, trapping him in a constant cycle of guilt and regret. He had long since given up trying to explain himself. The why of it all seemed irrelevant now. Nothing could justify what he had done. The truth was brutal, inescapable, and raw. Shannon,
Bella.
Celeste. He had taken them from the world. And there would be no redemption for that. In the quiet of his cell, Chris often tried to escape into his memories, but they only brought more pain. He couldn't remember the good times without the crushing weight of the bad. Their faces, once filled with love and trust, had been replaced by fear and confusion in his mind. The sounds of their last moments, the terror in their voices, echoed through his thoughts. There was no escaping it. No way to numb the pain. Days passed without distinction. Each one bled into the next. But the emptiness inside him never faded. He had no hope for the future. No purpose. No family to return to. There was nothing left for him. Even as the years rolled by, the consequences of his actions never dulled. Prison had taken everything, but it hadn't taken his memories. They were there, always present, never leaving him. And the truth was clear now, as stark as the cold concrete walls around him. He was a murderer. A man who had destroyed the people he loved. A man who had torn his own family apart. No matter how many years he spent behind bars, no matter how many apologies he made, it could never undo what had been done. The world would remember him for his crime. But in the silence of his cell, Chris realized that he was the one who would never forget. He was the one who would carry this burden for the rest of his life. There was no escaping it. No going back. There was only the truth. And that truth would haunt him for as long as he lived. The years had passed, dragging on with the heavy weight of regret. Chris sat in his cell, his face gaunt, eyes hollow, a man who had long since lost any sense of self. Prison had become a familiar, suffocating prison of its own, but it was nothing compared to the prison inside his mind. The walls around him weren't the ones that chained him the most. It was the guilt, the memories, the truth. Shannon, Bella, and Celeste. Their faces had never left him. They haunted him, not in his dreams, but in every waking moment. They had been the light of his life, the reason he had once smiled, laughed, dreamed. Now, they were only shadows, faint echoes of a life he had destroyed with his own hands. And yet, the thing that hurt most wasn't the years in prison, the judgment, or the isolation. It was the fact that no matter how many times he relived it, no matter how much he cried out to the empty walls for forgiveness, he knew there would be no way to undo the horror. He had chosen this. He had chosen to take their lives, to end their futures, to rip apart the very fabric of his family. The choices he made that night had been his own. Now, the weight of those choices was all he had left. There were no answers. No reasons that could ever make it right. His confession hadn't brought peace. It hadn't healed anything. Time hadn't healed anything either. Every hour, every second that passed only deepened the wound. As Chris sat alone in the cold darkness of his cell, he realized something. He would never escape this. There was no redemption. No second chance. And the truth, the raw, painful truth, would be his constant companion until his last breath. What had happened to him wasn't just about a man who had killed his family. It was the story of a man who lost everything, and in the end, found only the reflection of his own monstrous actions staring back at him. He would be remembered as the man who destroyed what he loved. And that would be the final, inescapable truth of his life. As he lay down in the bed, staring up at the cold ceiling, Chris closed his eyes. The faces of Sean, Bella, and Celeste swam in his mind, their eyes following him into the dark. And there, in that silence, he finally understood. There was no escape from the consequences.